Before the world wakes, a single decision is made in silence. It is not announced, applauded, or recorded, yet it shapes everything that follows. This story follows one ordinary day that becomes extraordinary through choice. The choice to live Christ-like. From the stillness before dawn to the pressure of conflict, from hidden battles of the heart to storms that test endurance, every moment asks the same question again. Will faith lead, or will habit take control? What begins as a whisper becomes a witness. This is not a tale of perfection, but of persistence, surrender, and grace, renewing life one faithful step at a time, for all who dare choose. In the quiet stillness of the early morning, long before the world begins to stir, a profound moment unfolds in silence. Streets remain empty, lights are dim, and time itself seems to slow as the day waits to be born. Observations from countless early risers suggest that this brief window before dawn carries an unusual weight, as if the air itself is holding a question yet to be answered. In this fragile calm, the soul awakens before the body fully does, becoming aware that a new day has arrived without having been shaped yet. As the sky slowly shifts from deep darkness to the faintest shades of blue, memories from yesterday begin to surface. Regrets, missed opportunities, unspoken words, and private failures quietly return, not with force, but with persistence. These reflections do not shout. They whisper, reminding the heart of choices once made and paths once taken. Reports from personal reflections indicate that this is the moment when many feel torn between carrying yesterday forward or allowing it to remain behind as the sun prepares to rise. At the center of this stillness stands a crossroads, unseen but deeply felt. One path leads back to familiar patterns driven by comfort, desire, and self-preservation. The other calls for surrender, discipline, and trust in something greater than the self. This moment frames the defining question of the day. Will today be lived according to the flesh, reacting to impulses and fears, or will it be lived for Christ, guided by truth, love, and purpose? The decision is quiet, yet its consequences will echo through every hour that follows. As the first light touches the horizon, the dawn becomes more than a change in the sky. It becomes a symbol of mercy renewed. Each sunrise arrives without accusation, offering itself freely even to those who believe they do not deserve it. This gentle light speaks of grace that does not depend on yesterday's success or failure. It declares, without words, that beginnings are still possible and that restoration does not require perfection, only willingness. Within this sacred pause, the heart begins to lean toward a choice. No one else is present to witness it, yet it remains one of the most powerful decisions a person can make. To choose what is good and Christ-like does not mean the absence of struggle, but the presence of intention. In this early hour, before the world makes its demands, the soul quietly commits itself to a different way of walking through the day. As morning finally breaks and life slowly resumes its rhythm, the moment before dawn fades into memory. Yet the choice made in that silence does not disappear. It moves forward, shaping words spoken, reactions formed, and actions taken. Today begins not with noise, but with a decision born in stillness, a decision that sets the course for a day lived not by habit, but by faith. The day that was quietly set in motion before dawn now begins to gather momentum. As morning light fills rooms and streets awaken, the choice made in silence does not remain untouched. Reports from lived experience suggest that the moment the world begins to move, resistance follows. The calm of early prayer gives way to noise, responsibility, and pressure, and the soul that committed itself to walk with Christ now finds that commitment immediately tested. What unfolds next is not visible to cameras or headlines, yet it is one of the most intense conflicts a person can face. Inside the heart, two forces begin to pull in opposite directions. On one side stands the flesh, old habits, selfish desires, impatience, pride, and fear, quick to react and eager to reclaim control. On the other stands the spirit, calling for restraint, humility, forgiveness, and obedience. This internal struggle does not announce itself loudly, but its presence is unmistakable. Witness accounts from daily life reveal how subtle this battle can be. A single thought, a careless word, or a familiar temptation can ignite it without warning. The flesh argues for comfort and ease, reminding the mind of shortcuts and justifications. It insists that change can wait, that grace excuses effort, and that survival comes before surrender. These arguments feel natural, even reasonable, because they echo voices heard many times before. At the same time, the Spirit speaks in a different tone, calm, steady, and persistent. It does not force, but it invites. It recalls the decision made before dawn, bringing it back into focus. The Spirit urges patience where anger wants to rise, truth where compromise seems easier, and love where judgment feels deserved. This voice is quieter, yet it carries weight, asking not for perfection, but for faithfulness. As the hours progress, the battle intensifies. Every interaction becomes a field of engagement. At work, at home, and even in moments of solitude, the believer is faced with choices that appear small but carry lasting impact. News from ordinary moments confirms a deeper reality. Christ-like living is not decided once in prayer, but repeatedly in action. Each decision either strengthens the Spirit's lead or gives ground back to the flesh. There are moments when the struggle feels overwhelming. Fatigue sets in, emotions flare, and the desire to revert to old patterns grows stronger. In these moments, the flesh promises immediate relief, while the Spirit calls for endurance. This tension reveals an uncomfortable truth. Choosing Christ does not remove difficulty. It exposes it. Yet it is within this exposure that growth begins. Observers of spiritual transformation note that victory in this battle rarely comes through dramatic gestures. Instead, it is found in small acts of obedience. A restrained response, a silent prayer, a decision to walk away, or a willingness to listen. These moments often go unnoticed by others, but they mark significant progress in the unseen war within. Still, setbacks occur. There are instances when the flesh gains the upper hand, leading to regret and disappointment. However, the narrative does not end there. Unlike condemnation, conviction points forward. The Spirit does not abandon the believer after a stumble. It calls them back, reminding them that failure is not final and that grace remains available. As midday approaches, the believer becomes more aware of the ongoing nature of this conflict. The battle between flesh and spirit is not confined to a single moment, but stretches across the day. Yet with each conscious choice to follow the Spirit, strength begins to build. What once felt impossible starts to feel intentional, even though it remains difficult. The day closes with a sobering but hopeful realization. The war within will not disappear, but it can be fought, and it can be won. The choice made before dawn has not been wasted. It has simply entered its proving ground. As the day continues, the believer moves forward carrying both the weight of the struggle and the quiet confidence that choosing what is Christ-like, even in conflict, is already a victory. The internal battle that defined the early hours of the day does not fade quietly. As the believer moves forward from the tension between flesh and spirit, a deeper need begins to surface, the need for direction. Reports from moments of pause amid busy schedules indicate that after struggle comes hunger, not for control, but for clarity. The soul that has wrestled longs to hear something steady, something true, something greater than the noise of competing desires. It is often in brief interruptions, between tasks, during a quiet commute, or in the stillness of a short prayer, that the voice begins to emerge. This voice does not arrive with force or spectacle. There are no signs in the sky or dramatic declarations. Instead, it comes gently, cutting through confusion with precision. Observers of faith describe it as a calm certainty, a reminder that the believer is not navigating the day alone. This calling voice frequently arrives through scripture, recalled or newly encountered. A single verse rises to the surface of memory, speaking directly into the conflict described earlier. Where the flesh argued for convenience, the word calls for faithfulness. Where fear demanded protection, truth speaks of trust. The timing feels intentional, as though the message was waiting for the exact moment it was needed. Unlike the demands of the flesh, this voice does not accuse. It reveals. It exposes motives without shaming and redirects without condemning. Those who listen closely report a shift within, a sense that the weight of decision-making no longer rests solely on their own strength. The voice points not to what must be proven, but to who must be followed. As the day unfolds, this guidance begins to shape perception. Situations that once triggered impulsive reactions are now met with pause. The believer starts to recognize patterns. Moments when ignoring the voice leads back to inner turmoil, and moments when following it brings peace, even if circumstances remain difficult. This awareness becomes a turning point, transforming spiritual struggle into spiritual attentiveness. The voice also calls for surrender, which proves to be its most challenging demand. It asks for control to be released, for pride to be set aside, and for trust to replace certainty. Reports from personal reflection reveal that this is where many hesitate. Surrender feels risky, especially after failure. Yet the voice remains patient, repeating its call without pressure. In some cases, the response is immediate. The believer stops, prays, and listens. In others, resistance lingers. Still, the voice does not withdraw. It continues to whisper truth into thought patterns shaped by fear and habit. This persistence becomes evidence of grace, an assurance that God does not abandon his people in the midst of their struggle. As attention sharpens, the believer begins to distinguish this voice from others. It never contradicts love, never promotes harm, and never leads toward bitterness. Its direction aligns with humility, forgiveness, and courage. Over time, this discernment strengthens, turning what was once unfamiliar into something deeply recognizable. Midway through the day, the believer realizes that the battle described in the previous chapter has not been silenced, but it has been reframed. The conflict is no longer fought blindly. The voice of God has introduced wisdom into the struggle, offering light where confusion once dominated. The guidance that emerged earlier in the day now leads the believer into a more difficult phase of the journey. After hearing the voice that calls and receiving direction, attention turns inward. Reports from moments of honest reflection suggest that clarity often brings confrontation. The light that guides forward also reveals what must be left behind, and this realization marks a decisive turning point in the unfolding story. As the day advances, memories that were once ignored begin to surface with greater intensity. Past failures, repeated mistakes, and deeply rooted habits no longer remain hidden in the background. Instead, they stand exposed, illuminated by the truth that has already been heard. This exposure is uncomfortable, yet necessary. According to many personal accounts, it is impossible to follow Christ fully while still clinging to identities shaped by regret and sin. The old self, familiar and persistent, resists release. It speaks through guilt and shame, reminding the believer of every reason they should remain unchanged. It argues that transformation is unrealistic, that the past is permanent, and that broken patterns cannot be undone. These voices attempt to weaken resolve by turning reflection into self-condemnation, threatening to undo the progress made earlier in the day. Yet the voice heard in the morning does not remain silent during this confrontation. Instead of echoing accusation, it offers truth grounded in grace. It reminds the believer that repentance is not about punishment, but restoration. Observers of spiritual renewal note that this moment, when guilt is met with mercy, often becomes the birthplace of lasting change. Letting go of the old self requires an intentional act of surrender. It means releasing not only sinful behaviors, but also the false identities built around them. The believer is no longer defined by past anger, fear, or failure. This shift does not happen instantly, but it begins with a conscious decision to accept forgiveness rather than rehearse regret. There is a cost to this release. Walking away from familiar patterns, even harmful ones, creates a sense of loss. The old self may have been destructive, but it was known. Stepping into renewal means entering uncertainty, trusting that obedience will lead to something better than what is being left behind. Reports from similar journeys confirm that this is often where faith is tested most deeply. As the believer continues through the day, moments of repentance quietly reshape the heart. Apologies are formed, attitudes soften, and resistance weakens. These changes rarely draw attention, yet they represent significant internal movement. The old self does not disappear all at once, but its influence begins to loosen its grip. What replaces it is not emptiness, but purpose. The believer begins to sense a new identity taking shape, one rooted not in past behavior, but in grace received. This identity is not earned through effort, but accepted through faith. It brings relief where shame once lived and hope where despair once lingered. By this stage of the day, the earlier battle between flesh and spirit has taken on new clarity. The struggle is no longer about mere self-control, but about allegiance. Each choice either revives the old self or strengthens the new one. The believer becomes increasingly aware that transformation is not accidental. It is sustained by repeated surrender. The believer stands lighter than before. The past has not been erased, but it no longer defines the present. Leaving the old self behind proves to be both painful and freeing, marking a critical step forward in the journey toward Christlikeness. The day continues, not untouched by struggle, but guided by a heart that has chosen renewal over return. With the old self consciously set aside, the believer now steps fully into the world as it is, imperfect, demanding, and often unkind. Reports from the later hours of the day confirm that renewal does not take place in isolation. It is immediately tested in real environments, where pressure, conflict, and unpredictability define daily life. The decision to live differently must now survive contact with a broken world. As responsibilities accumulate, the believer encounters familiar settings, workplaces, homes, streets, and conversations, yet experiences them through a changed lens. Where frustration once came easily, there is now hesitation. Where judgment once felt justified, compassion begins to surface. Observers note that this shift is subtle but significant, marking the transition from internal transformation to visible action. Conflict soon emerges, as it inevitably does. A harsh word, an unfair demand, or an unexpected disappointment becomes the next proving ground. The flesh, though weakened, still reacts quickly, urging defense and retaliation. However, the spirit now carries greater influence, recalling the earlier surrender and the identity no longer rooted in the past. The believer pauses, choosing response over reaction. Walking like Christ does not mean avoiding difficulty. It means meeting it differently. Instead of returning insult for insult, restraint is practiced. Instead of asserting dominance, humility takes shape. Reports from everyday encounters reveal that these choices often feel costly, misunderstood, and lonely. Yet they also produce an unexpected strength, one not fueled by control, but by conviction. As the day progresses, moments of quiet obedience begin to accumulate. A patient response diffuses tension. A kind gesture interrupts hostility. A willingness to listen opens space for understanding. These actions rarely make headlines, yet they carry transformative weight. According to those observing from the outside, something distinct becomes visible, even if it cannot be easily explained. Not every encounter ends in peace. There are times when choosing Christ-like behavior does not change the outcome, only the heart of the one choosing it. The believer learns that faithfulness is not measured by results, but by alignment with truth. This realization deepens maturity, reinforcing that obedience is valuable even when it goes unnoticed. Fatigue begins to settle in as the hours pass. Maintaining grace requires effort, especially in an environment that does not reward it. Still, the believer draws strength from earlier moments of guidance and surrender. Each Christ-like choice reinforces the next, forming a rhythm of obedience that becomes easier to sustain with practice. Others begin to notice the change. There are brief glances, unexpected questions, and moments of curiosity. The believer does not preach or explain, but simply continues to walk differently. This quiet consistency becomes a living testimony, demonstrating that transformation is real and active, not merely spoken. By now, the believer understands that walking like Christ is not about perfection. Mistakes still occur, and patience still falters. Yet the overall direction has changed. The path is no longer dictated by impulse, but by intention. Each step, though imperfect, moves forward rather than backward. The believer remains fully immersed in the world, yet no longer shaped by it in the same way. The brokenness remains visible, but it no longer dictates behavior. Walking like Christ proves to be both challenging and powerful. A daily practice that transforms ordinary moments into opportunities for grace as the journey continues. As the day moves beyond its midpoint, the momentum built through obedience begins to meet resistance of a different kind. Reports from late-day experiences indicate that even the most intentional choices can be worn down by fatigue. Physical tiredness, emotional strain, and accumulated pressure begin to surface, threatening to erode the resolve formed earlier. The believer who walked with clarity now faces the weight of endurance. The world does not slow to accommodate faith. Deadlines remain, conflicts linger unresolved, and unexpected problems emerge without warning. In these moments, the earlier joy of transformation feels distant. The believer discovers that perseverance, not passion, is now required. This phase of the day exposes a deeper layer of trust, one that must exist even when motivation fades. Doubt begins to whisper quietly. Questions surface about whether the effort is worth the cost, whether obedience truly matters when outcomes remain unchanged. Observers of spiritual life note that this is often the most dangerous moment, not marked by open rebellion, but by gradual weariness. Faith is not attacked directly. It is simply exhausted. Yet the lessons of the morning and afternoon do not disappear. The voice once heard in stillness returns, not with new instruction, but with reassurance. It recalls earlier moments of grace, reminding the believer that faith is not sustained by feeling, but by truth. In this reminder, the believer finds a reason to continue even without emotional strength. Prayer during this stage becomes simpler, less expressive, yet more honest. There are no long reflections, only quiet appeals for help. According to many testimonies, these are often the most powerful prayers, spoken not from confidence, but from dependence. The believer acknowledges limitation and reaches outward, choosing trust over self-reliance. The flesh attempts one final appeal, suggesting withdrawal or compromise as a form of relief. It promises rest through avoidance and comfort through disengagement. However, the believer, now more aware of this pattern, recognizes the cost. Giving up would not remove the weight. It would only replace it with regret. Small acts of faith take center stage. The believer chooses to finish well rather than escape early. Patience is practiced one more time. Integrity is upheld when shortcuts are available. These choices feel heavier than those made earlier, yet they carry greater significance because they are made in weakness rather than strength. As evening approaches, the believer notices a subtle shift. Though the circumstances remain difficult, the internal pressure begins to ease. Holding on has produced quiet resilience. This endurance does not generate excitement, but it builds depth, reinforcing that faith is not only about moments of victory, but about remaining steady through strain. Others may never see this struggle. From the outside, the day appears ordinary. Yet internally, something significant has taken place. The believer has learned that Christ-like living includes not only compassion and humility, but persistence when comfort is absent. With a sober but hopeful understanding, faith that survives exhaustion is faith that has matured. The day may be heavy, but it has not broken the believer. Holding on through weariness becomes its own form of worship, preparing the heart for what lies ahead as the journey continues toward its final hours. As the day moves toward its closing hours, the effects of endurance begin to extend beyond the believer's inner world. Reports from late-day encounters suggest a noticeable shift, not dramatic, but undeniable. The faith that was quietly held through exhaustion now starts to show itself outwardly. Without intention or announcement, the believer's steady presence begins to influence the atmosphere around them. In workplaces, homes, and public spaces, small interactions take on new meaning. A calm response where tension was expected, a patient pause where frustration once ruled, or a gentle word offered at the right moment begins to stand out. Observers may not understand the source, but they recognize the difference. The believer, once consumed by internal struggle, now becomes a point of contrast in a restless environment. This transformation does not rely on preaching or persuasion. There are no speeches, no explanations, and no attempts to be noticed. Instead, the light appears through consistency. When others react sharply, the believer responds with restraint. When negativity spreads, the believer refuses to participate. These quiet choices begin to speak louder than words ever could. According to shared experiences, this is often when questions arise. A colleague pauses and asks how calm was maintained. A family member notices a softened attitude. A stranger responds unexpectedly to kindness. These moments, though brief, reveal the reach of a life lived differently. The believer realizes that obedience has created openings that argument never could. Still, becoming a light brings its own challenges. Not every response is positive. Some misinterpret gentleness as weakness, and humility as submission. There are moments of misunderstanding and dismissal. Yet the believer, shaped by earlier endurance, no longer depends on approval. The purpose is not recognition, but faithfulness. As the evening unfolds, the believer becomes more aware of the responsibility carried by example. Each action now has the potential to either reinforce or contradict the Christ-like path chosen earlier. This awareness does not create pressure, but focus. The believer understands that influence is inevitable, whether intentional or not. Light, by nature, does not compete with darkness. It simply reveals. In the same way, the believer's presence begins to uncover hidden tensions and unspoken needs in others. A listening ear provides relief. A respectful response restores dignity. These moments confirm that transformation was never meant to remain private. The believer also recognizes that this light is not self-generated. It is not the result of personality or discipline alone. It flows from the choices made throughout the day. Choices to listen, to surrender, to endure, and to obey. This realization protects against pride and keeps gratitude at the center. As night approaches, there is a quiet satisfaction, not rooted in accomplishment, but alignment. The believer has not changed the world, but has remained faithful within it. That faithfulness, though seemingly small, has touched lives in ways that may never be fully known. With a powerful truth emerging from the day's events, choosing what is Christlike inevitably reaches beyond the self. A life shaped by grace becomes a signal in the darkness, guiding without force and inviting without demand. As the day nears its end, the believer carries forward not only faith, but light, ready to face the final hours ahead. As night settles in and the noise of the day slowly fades, the believer arrives at the final threshold. Reports from the closing hours reveal a return to stillness, different from the silence before dawn, yet deeply connected to it. The light that once rose in the morning now gives way to darkness, and with it comes reflection. The day, with all its battles, choices, endurance and quiet victories, stands complete and ready to be offered back to God. This moment is not marked by exhaustion alone, but by awareness. The believer reviews the day honestly, recognizing moments of faithfulness as well as moments of weakness. There is no attempt to exaggerate success or hide failure. According to shared experiences, this honesty becomes the foundation of true prayer, allowing gratitude and repentance to exist side by side. The prayer itself is simple, yet weighty. Words are spoken not to impress, but to surrender. Thanks are given for strength received during weakness, for guidance that came at the right time, and for grace that covered mistakes. The believer acknowledges that none of the day's endurance was achieved alone. Every Christ-like choice is traced back to divine help rather than personal discipline. At the same time, unresolved struggles are laid down. Moments where patience failed, fear returned, or the flesh regained ground are openly confessed. There is no despair in this confession, only trust. The believer has learned that failure does not cancel faith, it deepens dependence. This closing prayer becomes a place of restoration rather than regret. Observers of spiritual life often note that this final act of prayer reshapes memory itself. The day is no longer remembered primarily for its difficulty, but for God's presence within it. The believer begins to see how each chapter of the day, conflict, guidance, surrender, endurance and witness, was connected by grace working quietly beneath the surface. As the prayer continues, the focus shifts forward. Tomorrow is acknowledged as unknown and unguaranteed. The believer does not ask for ease, but for faithfulness. There is a renewed commitment to begin again, knowing that the choice made before dawn will need to be made once more. This forward-looking surrender turns the end of the day into preparation rather than closure. Peace begins to settle, not because every question has been answered, but because trust has been reaffirmed. The believer rests in the understanding that Christ-like living is not measured by a single day, but built through daily recommitment. Each night seals what was learned, strengthening the heart for what lies ahead. In this stillness, the believer recognizes a profound transformation. The person who stood at the crossroads before dawn is not the same one kneeling now. Though imperfect, they are more attentive, more resilient, and more aware of God's nearness. The day has shaped them, not through ease, but through faith practiced in real time. The world outside may never record these events. There are no headlines announcing perseverance, no alerts for quiet obedience. Yet in the unseen realm, something significant has taken place. A life has been offered, not in parts, but in full. Morning to night, struggle to surrender. Where the story began, in stillness. But now the silence carries assurance. The day has been lived with intention, sealed in prayer, and entrusted to God. As rest arrives, the believer carries one enduring truth into the night. Every sunrise offers a new beginning, and every faithful day, surrendered in prayer, becomes an act of worship that echoes beyond its hours. The story does not end with rest. As the night gives way to the faint promise of another dawn, reports from the quiet hours confirm a powerful truth. Faith does not conclude, it continues. The prayer that sealed the previous day now becomes the bridge into a new one. What was surrendered in the darkness prepares the heart to face the light once more, proving that Christ-like living is not a single chapter, but an ongoing narrative. As the first moments of morning arrive, the believer awakens carrying both memory and expectation. The peace found the night before has not erased yesterday's struggles, but it has reframed them. Each victory and failure now stands as a lesson rather than a burden. Observers of spiritual rhythm note that this awareness transforms waking up from routine into readiness. The stillness before dawn returns, echoing the very beginning of the journey. Yet this silence feels different. It is no longer unfamiliar or intimidating. The believer recognizes it as sacred ground, a familiar meeting place where decisions are formed. Once again, the crossroads appears, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet invitation to choose how the day will be lived. The question remains unchanged, but the heart responding to it has grown. Will today be lived according to the flesh, reacting to pressure and desire, or according to Christ, guided by truth and grace? This choice no longer feels abstract. It is informed by lived experience, shaped by endurance, and strengthened by grace already received. There is a renewed humility in this moment. The believer does not assume success or fear failure. Instead, they acknowledge dependence. Reports from those who walk this path consistently reveal that maturity does not eliminate struggle. It deepens trust. The decision to follow Christ is made again, not with confidence in self, but with reliance on God. As morning light spreads, intention begins to form. Prayer is offered not as a last resort, but as a first response. The believer asks for guidance before action, wisdom before speech, and love before reaction. This early alignment sets the tone for everything that will follow, anchoring the day before it unfolds. The memory of being a light to others lingers, reinforcing purpose. The believer understands that today's choices will once again ripple outward. Each interaction carries potential influence, each response an opportunity. This awareness does not create pressure, but meaning, reminding the believer that ordinary moments are never insignificant. There is also realism. The believer knows the battle between flesh and spirit will return. Fatigue will come, resistance will surface, and endurance will be required again. Yet there is confidence rooted in experience. Holding on is possible, grace is sufficient, and failure is never final. As the day officially begins, the believer steps forward not as someone starting over, but as someone continuing. Yesterday's faithfulness has prepared the ground for today's obedience. The journey toward Christlikeness moves ahead, not in leaps, but in steady steps shaped by daily surrender. With a powerful continuation rather than a conclusion. The cycle of dawn, decision, struggle, and surrender begins again, but now with deeper awareness and steadier faith. The story moves forward, proving that every new morning is not merely another day, but another chance to choose what is good, what is Christlike, and what leads life ever closer to Him. As the new day advances beyond its opening hours, reports indicate that the choice made at dawn begins to encounter the familiar pace of real life. Morning intentions meet unexpected demands, and the believer quickly realizes that choosing again was only the beginning. What now matters is living that choice consistently, hour by hour, as the day unfolds with both ordinary routines and unforeseen challenges. The earlier awareness gained from past days brings a sharpened vigilance. The believer notices how quickly distractions arise and how subtly priorities can shift. Small compromises present themselves as harmless, even practical. Yet experience has taught that these moments are rarely insignificant. Faith that endures is built not in dramatic crises, but in how these quiet decisions are handled. As interactions multiply, the believer becomes increasingly conscious of alignment. Words are weighed more carefully, reactions slowed, and motives examined. This attentiveness is not rooted in fear of failure, but in desire for faithfulness. Observers note that such intentional living creates a noticeable steadiness, even when circumstances remain unstable. Pressure builds as responsibilities stack and expectations rise. The flesh once again offers efficiency without integrity and relief without obedience. However, the believer now recognizes these patterns earlier. Instead of reacting instinctively, there is a pause, a brief internal check shaped by prayer and prior surrender. This pause becomes a powerful tool, redirecting actions before damage is done. There are moments when consistency feels costly. Choosing patience delays progress. Choosing honesty complicates situations. Choosing compassion invites vulnerability. Yet reports from those walking this path confirm that these costs are never wasted. What appears to slow life down actually deepens it, anchoring the believer in values that do not shift with circumstance. Fatigue attempts to reclaim ground, especially when obedience seems repetitive and unrewarded. Still, the believer recalls that faithfulness is not measured by visible outcomes. Holding the line, even without affirmation, becomes an act of trust. In this persistence, character continues to form quietly but firmly. The influence described in earlier chapters begins to stabilize. The believer no longer surprises others with isolated acts of grace. Instead, a pattern emerges. Consistency builds credibility. People may not agree with the believer's convictions, but they recognize authenticity. This steady witness reinforces the truth that a Christ-like life speaks most clearly over time. Internally, the believer senses a shift from effort to rhythm. What once required intense focus now flows more naturally. This does not mean the struggle has ended, but that obedience has become practiced. Faith moves from being a daily challenge to becoming a daily posture, shaping how the believer approaches both difficulty and rest. As the day progresses, the believer understands that enduring faith is not about maintaining perfection, but about remaining oriented toward Christ. When missteps occur, recovery is quicker. When doubt arises, prayer follows sooner. Growth is evident not in the absence of weakness, but in the speed of return to truth. With a grounded realization, choosing what is Christ-like is not a single event repeated each morning, but a life formed through continual alignment. The story moves forward not through dramatic turning points, but through sustained obedience lived in real time. Faith that endures beyond the moment becomes the quiet force shaping a life that steadily reflects Christ, one faithful choice at a time. As the day stretches on and faith settles into rhythm, new reports emerge of an unexpected shift. What once felt steady is suddenly disrupted. A difficult conversation, an unforeseen setback, or a sharp disappointment breaks into the flow of consistency. The believer quickly realizes that enduring faith will not be preserved in calm alone. It must now withstand pressure. This chapter marks the moment when stability is tested by adversity. The storm does not arrive dramatically. It enters quietly, through news that alters plans or words that cut deeper than expected. The believer feels the familiar pull of the flesh once more, urging defense, frustration, or retreat. Despite all previous growth, the initial reaction proves that faith, while strengthened, still lives within human weakness. Yet something is different this time. The pause that once had to be forced now comes naturally. The believer does not rush to respond, but stands still within the tension. Observers of inner transformation note that this pause, born of practiced obedience, often determines whether a challenge becomes a defeat or a defining victory. The Spirit's guidance, cultivated through repeated listening, becomes clearer under pressure. Instead of panic, there is discernment. Instead of escalation, restraint. The believer remembers that storms do not negate calling. They refine it. This awareness steadies the heart even as circumstances remain unsettled. Standing firm proves costly. Choosing grace when wounded feels unfair. Maintaining integrity when misunderstood feels isolating. Yet the believer resists the temptation to abandon Christ-like conduct for temporary relief. Reports from similar trials confirm that this is where faith matures most, when obedience is chosen without emotional reward. Others watch closely now. Consistency during peace is admirable, but consistency during conflict is revealing. The believer's response, though imperfect, carries credibility. It confirms that the faith practiced earlier was not situational, but rooted. This visible steadiness becomes a powerful testimony, even in silence. Internally, the believer confronts fear, the fear of loss, rejection, or failure. Rather than denying it, the believer brings it into prayer. This honest surrender transforms fear from a controlling force into an offering. Faith does not eliminate fear. It refuses to let fear lead. As the storm continues, endurance replaces urgency. The believer no longer seeks immediate resolution, but faithful presence. This shift changes perspective. The situation is no longer something to escape, but something to walk through with Christ. Strength is drawn not from certainty, but from companionship with God. Eventually, the intensity begins to ease. The problem may not be fully resolved, but the believer remains standing. There is no triumphal celebration, only quiet gratitude. Surviving the test without surrendering identity becomes